security systems in the continent. 4 decades ago, the Americas were going through one of its worst crises. Political elites, economic elites, and technocratical elites wanted to convince us that public health services, the attention for senior citizens, and fringe benefits due to sickness and disabilities were a barrier for the economic development. Therefore, they told us that these protections looked at dependency and paternalism, that they didn't allow private initiative to breathe, and they were loading excess tasks for states. So in the 80s and 90s, they tried to dismount these well-being systems that were incipient, that our mothers, fathers, and grandparents had helped to found, and they were benefited from. So in the isolated offices in the ministries of the treasury, the owners of capital with technicians without any rights, they privatized health and pensions. They established minimum fringe benefits, and some gave them just coins for people to be able to buy food and survive. It's not, we should worry, because these had important social consequences, such as the growth of poverty and inequality. Today, we find ourselves before an important crisis that not only is economic, but is also sanitary as well. The COVID-19 pandemic, this tragic contingency has placed in the surface not having important comprehensive health systems and the right mechanisms to protect income. In other words, it said and told us the need to reform and change our social security, but the crisis cannot lead us, as it happened before at the end of the 2020, to socializing the losses and to the privatization of earnings and rights. Today, more than ever, we have to transform our systems to ensure the protection, dignity, and well being of people. And today, we have to do so through democratic social dialogues. We cannot decide over the life of people at closed doors, and we cannot negotiate only with the powerful parties. It is important to speak with the people, with the workers, with social organizations, and with multilateral bodies. We consider that the starting point should be a reminder that Social Security is not a fringe benefit, it's a human right acknowledged since 1948 in several legal international areas. So these cannot depend on considerations like age, the place of residence, the level of income, gender, and the situation, your labor situation, or your citizenship. In SISS, we've discussed the essence and features of Social Security from a focus of rights, and we have also reached the personal well-being and social well-being that includes some services that are public, and their basic responsibility is in the state. They want to protect collectivities before social risks, to reduce social vulnerability and promote the recovery with the consequences of a materialized risk. And that is how we elaborate the different times of life, and we promote inclusion and the recognition of social diversity. Under this framework that puts people in the main center, we developed the Social Security and Well-being Report that is an input for the discussion of the present and future of our social security system, as well as a source of knowledge that contributes to do the necessary changes so that the systems are in the proper condition to face the social challenges of the new century. Therefore, to this end, we developed a rigorous research work, and that we also built databases, and we used statistical techniques and case studies with qualitative techniques, and we saw the origin and evolution of the systems in our continent, and the result are 8 chapters of a rigorous and deep analysis. I'm going to stop briefly so I don't abuse of time in some ideas that were shown and presented in this report that are core. The first of them is that 70 years after Social Security became a human right, the access to its benefits is continually connected to work. So there's important amounts of popularity are excluded from Social Security, and this can be seen violently in moments like now in social and sanitary emergency moments. Therefore, as presented in this report, this is the second idea I recover. In the last 2 decades, we see advances in the coverage of health services, pensions due to old age, and benefits for families, but these improvements have been done through focalized instruments for people in poverty conditions and in vulnerable conditions, financed with the general taxes offering lower levels of protection than those insured in the contributive schemes or that have direct contributions. Therefore, in many cases, there's dual systems with special benefits, with lesser quality benefits for people in poverty conditions, and there's others better financed and more generous for those that are in labor formality. If this is a progress, at least to reduce the access gap, on the other hand, the institutionalized structure that assumes enjoying a right that people should have access under equal conditions. And that is, in our opinion, the main problem to be solved in the social security systems in the Americas. So it is not possible to solve it if we don't strengthen first the social security institutions, and moreover, if we don't reinforce the state that has to be the number one insurer of this human right and warrantor. So the political and economic liberal program didn't leave but critical states that could not give protection to the people, but only private companies. So we strengthened important companies that were connected to social securities, pharmaceutical, and to national, international financial capitals that enrich themselves uh, against the well-being. So they are not allowing us to have reforms to universalize these benefits and to turn the system into more equitable. In some cases, they say that the political science is the power of veto, and in factors that have to do and that affect thousands of millions of people. This way, the manufacturers of drugs are colluded against consumers, and this generates barriers for them to have access to health. Financial institutions and union organizations, they establish barriers so that we don't have fringe benefits for pensions. So they want the state to subsidize it, and that's what should be ended. The basis on which we have to build Social Security should not be profits. If we're looking for earnings, is not but something bad. The beginning of Social Security and the principles of Social Security have been, are, and will be solidarity, universality, progressivity, and the public is what belongs to us and benefits all of us. There's nothing else but recognize the hard work of the researchers that prepared this report, coordinated from the executive session of projects and investigation of SISS, and the careful work of edition, correction of style, and design headed by our editorial team. With nothing further, I'd like to give the floor to the people involved in the elaboration of this report in order of participation, and those I'd like to widely congratulate because of the result of this report, that is social sciences. Of the first nature is Mariela Sanchez Belmont, Miguel Ángel Ramírez Villela, Frida Romero, and Jose Antonio Hernandez. After their presentation, we're going to go to the comments of our guests. And finally, if we have the time, we're going to go to a Q&A session on behalf of the audience. Thank you so much for these welcoming words, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us to this presentation of this report. And it's been one of the most ambitious projects, but also, I dare saying, one of the ones that we're more enthusiastic in the research, project research. Since the beginning of CIS, one of the main goals has been promoting cooperation in order to improve social security. And that is going to help us since its statistics and its history. Therefore, we started working. And in the last stages of the elaboration of this report, a pandemic exploded that you've heard about, of course, that gave a new meaning to our work. And as mentioned by the Secretary General, the emergency due to COVID-19 has placed the importance of a robust social security system. Many families have lost their revenue sources. Those that receive it for informal sectors, such as the formal sector, it's evidence the importance of having unemployment insurance. It doesn't matter if you work in the formal or informal sector, as well as coverage due to illness. It's also clear the need of having and reinforcing public health services at all its levels. And besides that, aside the sanitary health, the pandemic caused an economic crisis. The effects will live for many years to come. And in this type of crisis global moment, where we learned along the research for this report, the development of social securities could give an important turn, can mean its expansion as the publication of the Social Security Act in the United States as part of the recovery systems in the years to come, like 2019, and the well-being expansion of well-being by the Beveridge report that had consequences in social security of our continent after the Second World War. But in this moment of crisis could lead us to a retraction of social security systems in order to provide services. Because of the crisis in 1970 and fostering this neoliberalism drive, the decades have used economic crisis in order to justify austerity policies that are translated in cutting social security expenses. Story tells us that economic and sanitary crisis is going to have repercussions and in the middle and long run in our social security system. It also teaches us the path we're taking is not predetermined, it's core, and therefore involving society in a dialogue with the different sectors in order to ensure that we come out of this crisis with a better protection before social expenses, a state that assumes its responsibility to ensure human rights and social security, and a population that knows and demands its rights. And therefore, ASSIS presents this report that its main goal is to get to know Social Security and the situation of countries in Social Security in order to formulate this recommendation of public policy to promote universal quality Social Security and for well-being in the Americas. The first chapters, 1 and 2, are an historical analysis of Social Security in our continent and the world.
We pay attention to the influence of economic, social, and political factors that led to this point. In the third chapter, we analyzed the indexes developed by the CIS team to measure efficacy and performance of systems in 19 countries in the Americas. From the results of this analysis, we chose 4 case studies for a more detailed qualitative states: Uruguay, Chile, Nicaragua, and Dominican Republic, each developed into a chapter. We also made a special chapter for countries of the CARICOM because they were not included in the qualitative analysis due to a lack of information for several indicators, which kept us from including them in chapter 13. We consider that the experience of the countries from CARICOM is extremely valuable, so we made a special case study for this region. In a few moments, my colleagues Miguel Ángel Ramírez and Frida Romero will present some of the findings of the report, and Togo Hernandez will close the presentation with some conclusions. Now, before I give them the floor, I would like to thank on behalf of the team and CIS our colleagues who made this work possible: Krishna Pushkato especially, Yuna Rodriguez, whose valuable was invaluable, and Jaimes, also Alejandra Torres, who did a fantastic and very careful work, and Septien for editing. This team was made it possible to make this very important document. I also want to thank Mr. Soto from the CEPAL for his feedback and help in developing this report. Now, thank you, welcome again, and I give the floor to Miguel. Thank you. Thank you, Mariela. What we're going to present to you are the main conclusions of our work. And the first thing that I would like to say is that the history of Social Security in Americas in the 20th century is a history of contradiction between its acknowledgement as human rights and its practice as a labor benefit. In essence, this is what we call, recalling Eric Hoffman, the long 20th century of Social Security. This century started with the foundation of Social Security institutions in countries in South America, such as Uruguay and Chile, during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Then came a period, a booming period, until the 80s, when most of the systems of the continent were founded and developed. And finally, concludes with a stage of intense transformation that meant a reduction in from the state's contribution to well-being and the participation of private interests, which resulted in a growing exclusion or inequity in access to those benefits. The systems appear to protect people from risks resulting from great social transformations that came from establishing modern labor markets in which people depend exclusively from their wages to satisfy their basic needs, and without a license they are prevented from working. That means a threat to their survival. In more technical terms, they appear to protect them from social risks. This is from contingencies that may lead to a loss of well-being that are the result of modern societies, and specifically of the performance of labor markets that nevertheless do not have random distribution but based on criteria such as gender, age, level of income, or labor condition. So, the first social security systems appear to protect workers from the modern sectors of economy, railroad, transport, or people dedicated to industry, but also public officials and members of the armed forces. The protection of all these sectors was not fortuitous, but the result of economic, social, and political processes. In some cases, in countries such as Uruguay, it came as part of a social and economic modernization project that would lead to changing political balance in a society controlled by agro-exporting interests. In others, like countries like Mexico in the 40s, it appeared due to the response to workers' activities that could unstabilize an authoritarian regime, so they tried to secure political loyalty by providing benefits to the best organized sectors, regardless of the specific conditions under which they were born. The access to those benefits was reserved to people who had a formal job. The greatest promotion to the development of social security systems appeared starting in 1940 with accelerated economic growth of that time that in some countries caused an important industrial development. Even though Social Security was recognized as a human right since 1948, the systems were developed until the end of the 70s by the incorporation almost exclusively of those who had a formal job. Its growth was stopped suddenly with a serious economic crisis that appeared in most of the countries in the Americas during the 80s. Now, with the excuse of making the system sustainable, reducing tax load, and give people freedom to take advantage of the well-being, even though this assumed letting them at the mercy of the force of the market, Some health systems were privatized, public spending was reduced, and some focalized programs were established for poor people as a result of these attempts at dismantling of the recurring economic crisis and the reduction of the state. The levels of poverty and inequality grew. According to data from CEPAL, between 1980 and 1990, the population in poverty went from 40.5 to 48.4%. When when the 2000 came in, they tried to solve some of the most serious problems caused by these so-called structural reforms. In some few cases, the privatizations of the pension systems were reverted, but in most countries, they only promoted small changes to consider the high levels of exclusion and inequity caused by the growing participation of private interests, but without modifying in essence the structure inherited from the two previous decades. Now, to analyze this last period, we developed a series of indexes for several countries in 2009 and 2016. You can see the list on the slide, and the indicators also appear on that slide. These indexes refer to different dimensions of the performance of the social security systems: pressure, coverage, and efficacy. Also, the results were divided into four groups: high, medium, low, and very low. For the first dimension, we perform two indexes. On one hand, the depression that includes variables related to demographic and labor factors that put pressure to expand social security systems. The variables included in the results appear on this slide. And we should mention that these variables refer to the processes that promoted the development of these systems in the 20th century, those that appear on the left side. It includes variables such as urbanization, age, population aging, and some related with paid jobs. But this doesn't say much about factors linked to a high exclusion from Social Security, such as labor informality, non-paid work, or agricultural work. This is why we developed another index shown on the right named specific pressure, which was only possible to build for 2016 for 18 countries. Canada was not included here because of the lack of information for very specific population groups that tend to be excluded from Social Security. For example, the ones I mentioned before, people who work in the countryside. As you can see, both indexes show similar groupings but in the inverse way. This indicates that they consider different dimensions of the same process. Now we have the coverage index, whose variables and results appear on this slide, and they are mainly related to medical attendance and pensions for the people benefits. There's a great similarity between the groups produced by the pressure index and the coverage index. The countries with larger variables that put pressure to change the system are the ones that also tend to have a larger coverage level. The next one is the efficacy index that includes indicators regarding to results in health and protection of income. Now, the results of these indicators can be related with factors that are not akin to Social Security, for example, spending in health, um, child mortality, and others. It's also true that they are directly related to the benefits of pensions for old age and medical attendance. We can also see similarities regarding the stratification of the two previous indexes. With the results of these indexes, we made an aggregated measurement about the performance of the social security system. On one hand, the performance index from social security systems that includes the pressure index, coverage, and efficacy indexes, and on the other hand, on the right side, the index of specific pressure that includes the specific pressure index, coverage, As you can see, they generate similar groupings. As I said, they measure similar phenomena and dimensions. Due to time limitations, we do not show in depth the trends in the indicators that we included in these indexes, but you can see them in the report. You can see them in detail, and we also have for you all the data that we use to develop these indexes. Now, to analyze and go deeper in the relationships between these indexes, we prepared the following charts, where we have the pressure index and the coverage index. And what we can see in general terms is that something that I mentioned before, that at higher pressure, more points in the pressure index, there also tends to be more coverage. We can see this by considering distribution close to this trend line, and also we used the coverage index with the efficacy index and specific pressure. Each relationship goes in the inverse sense. In this axis we show the results of the index related to high exclusion from Social Security, and on this side, on the Y, we show the results of the coverage index. Here we can see that at more higher coverage there is higher efficacy, and these relationships that in most cases we can see an increase in pressure and then an increase in coverage, and then this leads to an increase in efficacy. These relationships are not automatic. This means they depend on contingent factors that cannot be quantitatively analyzed with statistical techniques. This is why we decided to choose 4 case studies that will allow us to go deeper into the relationships between the different dimensions that we analyzed. We chose Uruguay, Chile, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, and we chose them based on 2 criteria. They belong to each one of the strata identified in the performance index for the social security systems, and that they also had different trends in those indexes. Specifically, we were interested in these relationships between coverage and pressure, coverage and efficacy. Later on, we will go deeper into the relations and trends that we had in each case. Now, before we see these studies in depth, I'm going to show you the results of a brief analysis of the social security systems of countries that belong to the CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. Given the limitations in quantitative and qualitative information, it was not possible to include them in the indexes that I showed you, and we could not do an in-depth study as what we did for the 4 case studies. Now, in this slide, on this slide I show countries included in the social security systems of the CARICOM and some general data about this community. The first thing that I can mention about the social security systems in these countries is that they were developed in what we call the booming era between the 40s and 60s, more or less. And on the other hand, in the development of this social security system, there was an important influence from the English social security system, because many of these countries are former British colonies, and they were strongly influenced by the principles of the English system, especially the national health system, and they were also had strong influence of bilateral agencies like OIT through technical support, and due to the restrictions and conditions that these countries faced where they were recently independent, they had a gradual progress to establish these social security systems. Currently, these systems, although they have made great progress, they have some limitations in coverage. For example, there's an important absence of benefits for family or protection against unemployment, and they also have coverage that covers less than 50% of the population. This is not too different from what happens on other countries on the continent. An important characteristic, and here I'm showing you data. An important characteristic of these countries is, as I said, that they aspire to establish national health systems with universal coverage, and these countries have started the process. They have established commitments in this regard. They are implementing and developing them, designing them, and they are expanding and improving the coverage of their systems. They also have variable coverage in terms of the benefits they will provide, but an important characteristic is the presence of an agreement of protecting rights in Social Security. This agreement from countries in CARICOM allows to have access in another country of the same community as long as they were part of a institution of the community. They do long-term benefits such as old age, retirement, disability. The establishment of this agreement was due to the creation of a common market that allows free movement of goods, services, capital, and capacities. Yet, few people have used the protection granted by this agreement. For example, since the entry into force of the agreement in 1997 until 2015, only 135 pensions for old age had been processed through this agreement. Some of the reasons why there's low coverage of the system and also scarce use of this type of protection are high levels of informality and high rates of quotation for people who work independently, because if they want to join voluntarily, they would have to pay rates above 10% of their income. But the progress is noticeable of the social security systems in these countries, especially in their aspiration to have universal coverage, especially in health. Now, I give the floor to Frida Romero. She will talk about each one of the case studies: Uruguay, Chile, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Good morning. Thank you, Miguel. Now, as Miguel said, I'm going to talk about Uruguay, Chile, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. We will start with Uruguay. Uruguay, in the index of developed, had high pressure, high coverage, and high efficacy, and it was also in high performance. This means the pressure level came together with equivalent coverage with good results. Now, a brief history. Uruguay was one of the pioneer countries of Social Security in the continent. The foundation of the system was linked to a modern economic and social modernization project promoted by the Colorado Party. Protection aimed at work was expanded in the 20th century, and the high rate of labor allowed them to have very close to universal coverage. At the end of the 50s, they had already established universal coverage in pensions, and they had created family benefits due to unemployment and sickness. The establishment of a dictatorship in 1973 that lasted until 1985 did not change the system substantially. It was in the 90s with the democracy that the health system was deregulated, which led to an increase of the out-of-pocket expenses and generated a pillar of individual capitalization social system, and had more strict requirements to have access to a pension. As part of this, these reforms did not generate deep transformations in the system. In 2005, with the arrival of the Frente Amplio to power, a party with union tradition, there was great promotion to the social security system and led to the creation of the national system, integrated national system of health, which gave access to pensions for old age, expanded family benefits, and there was an unemployment insurance. It created the innovative integrated national system for care. All of this was possible because in Uruguay They implemented important elements such as strengthening the capacities and the role of the government in the operation of the social security system, and the new benefits became the responsibility of the social provision bank that prevented the fragmentation of the system. Today, Uruguay is one of the countries with more coverage and less exclusion in the continent. Can you see my slides? As you can see on this slide, starting the entry and operation of the health integrated system, national system, as you can see, coverage grew constantly. Out of the almost 800,000 members in 2007, it went to 2.5 million in 2018. It's the increase, the number of people that benefit from maternity and parental care has increased tremendously. Now, in the next case study, it was Chile. Chile is in the level of medium performance with high pressure and medium coverage and efficacy. This means that increasing pressure did not come together with an equivalent increase in coverage and didn't lead to greater efficacy in the system. Chile also founded a social security system early in the 20s, and it reached very high coverage also during the middle of the 20th century. But the universalist promotion of the popular government generated a retardation due to the dictatorship. They privatized totally the pension system, establishing the first system in all the world of capitalization into individual accounts managed by these private entities, the managers of pension funds. They also privatized partially the health system, and they created a private pillar where new private corporations, the institutions of health, competed freely with public sector in providing medical care. These changes generated great inequality, a reduction in coverage, and also empowerment of private interests that then would block attempts to improve equality in the social security system. After the dictatorship, during the first two democratic governments, starting the change of a century, the policies with universal orientations were promoted, trying to revert the effects of the neoliberal policies. Yet, the general structure of the system remained, which is still highly privatized. In this period in health, they established in 2005 a minimum package of benefits that all people have to have access to, and the health spending has increased, as we can see on the slide, on the first chart, which almost reached 4.5% in 2017. In spite of this, the dual system persisted with private services for those who have higher levels of income and less risks for health, and minimum coverage for people in poverty or who are vulnerable. Regarding pensions, in 2008 a solidarity pillar was introduced, and as you can see on the slide, starting that year there's an increase that reached 85.5% of coverage in 2017. With all of this, during the last decades, Chile has made considerable progress in providing more equivalent, more equal social security, but the structure from the 80s still remains. Therefore, demands for protection have been included to the claims that happened during the recent social disturbances. Therefore, popular representatives want to discuss how to take care of demands for greater protection to health and knowledge, and also guarantee the sustainability of the system without private interest preventing transformations that can lead to increase the well-being of the population. Then Dominican Republic, this country is in the low performance level with medium pressure, very low coverage, and very low efficacy. This is another case in which The high pressure did not come together with any increase in coverage. The social security system of the Dominican Republic was founded at the end of the 40s with the creation of the Dominican Box of Social Security that became the Dominican Institute of Social Security. The system had minimum development during the rest of the 20th century, given the strong tradition of the political regime of the Rafael Trujillo dictatorship that had these strategies to try to find a minimum of legitimacy. There was not an establishment of a social security system that was wide. This system only included people who worked in the private sector with an income below 1.6 times minimum wage, which excluded large groups of the population and did not guarantee attention for the family of the member. They strengthened private interest in the health sector because they were the main suppliers of services. This led to a high inequity or inequality in access. At the beginning of the 21st century, the Dominican society saw accelerated development facilitated by high economic growth and the support of multilateral organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. In 2001, they promulgated a series of laws whose main parts are the General Health Law and Law 8701 of Social Security. This legislative framework establishes an integral, plural system with universal aspirations that contrast the clientelar practices of the past. In this way, they configured three protection mechanisms in this Dominican Social Security system. One is the contribution regime for people who have a formal job, the associated regimen for low-income people and without a formal job, and the subsidized regime for people who work on their own and have medium or high level of income. This new legislation recognizes Social Security as a right for all the population, which leaves behind the clientele perspective of the previous regime. In spite of the large increase in coverage, specifically in health, as we can see on this slide, the effective compliance has been slow of the new regulatory framework until very recently. The subsidized pension program started to work and the other regime has not gone into force, so they need a decided promotion for the effective compliance of the law.
In Dominican Republic, what we do is impressive because it will continue like this in the next year. In this graph, you can see the evolution of the coverage between 2007 and 20 that is by far more than what they had in 2007. In 2020, the coverage is 70.7 of the population. In the next case study, that's Nicaragua, this country had a case that had a very low pressure and presented advances in coverage. However, it maintained in the low strata. So that's why they have very low performance. So the foundation to the Nicaraguan fund is changed in the 1950, and it was more unified than before because they were going to cover all the people that were in the private sector as well as the public sector. And the coverage was quite limited then. At the end of the 70s, it only covered 20% of the economically active population. Aside from that, the system worked without actuarial basis and sound techniques. The benefits were given according to government requests and not according to a legislation that would look at its provision. In 79, after the triumph of the Sandinista revolution, the Nicaraguan Social Security Institute reorganized in a comprehensive manner, transferring this to the Ministry of Health and creating the national unique health system, trying to fight the explosion based on the laboral tasks. They also created the Nicaraguan Social Security Institute in order to provide monetary provisions to people affiliated uh, to it and people under poverty and without formal jobs so they would have access to Social Security. After Sandinistas left power, there was a neoliberal Social Security agenda. They eliminated the unique health system and they privatized the services through the creation of provisional medical systems. Through that, the Nicaraguan system in Social Security became a financer of services that provided mainly by private organization, and they had free services but with lesser quality. Regarding pensions, in spite of the approval of the privatization of the system, this reform did not prosper because the costs and the transitions were higher than what had been estimated by the multilateral organisms that recommended an individual account system. In 2006, the return of Sandism pushed again the system with a new growth of public expenditure again that is shown in the next slide that places Nicaragua as one of the countries that spend the most in health in the country, and their expense is 5% of their GDP, in spite of having one of the lowest per capita income. Also, they created the reduced pension for those that did not have 750 weeks of the required quotes. So that produced a substantial increase of the coverage between senior citizens. And here we can appreciate that of 17.9% in 2013, it went up to 34% in 2017. So it's also important to mention that Nicaragua is one of the few countries that don't have a national non-contributive pension system. So in spite of these achievements, there's historical deficiencies in the system. One of them is the limited coverage due to high labor informality jobs, that is 74% of the total job. We have not achieved the financial sustainability, given the technical and actuarial limitations of many of the reforms fostered in the last 3 decades. And historically, there's a deficit of social dialogue to have changes through negotiation and inquiries, but the effort done in Nicaragua is notable to expand the coverage of the system, and it should be fostered through groups that have been excluded from Social Security. At the same time, they have to ensure the sustainability of the system. And with this, we finish this brief report of each of the cases, and I'd like to give the floor back to Jose Antonio Hernandez. Jose Antonio, please. Thank you so much, Frida. Thank you to the research team for all of this hard work that has led us to the conclusion of this important report, and to the editorial team, because this was quite fine work. The design looks very well. It's a very nice report and very good. I'd like to talk about the learnings and recommendations that come out of the construction of the indexes, as well as the qualitative case studies. So the conclusion is the need for countries to undertake decisive actions to ensure in an equal manner the right to Social Security. At present, a large amount of the population are still excluded or have access to benefits of lesser quality because of their working condition, place of residence, gender, age, or citizen condition. Governments and institutions, Social Security governments and institutions should solve the contradiction that this is a human right and this is a benefit, a work benefit. It's also important to see the duality of the systems and go as much as possible according to each country and state towards their unification, because this duality generates a notable difference in access to benefits and also the level of quality you can obtain from these benefits. Having said so, in an overall manner, some of the recommendations that are specific, that since the research came out for our members and for the public in general, have to do with one, looking at the blockage that can be imposed by private interests in order to ensure changes to expand coverage or look for equity in social security systems. And that is very clear. To give an example, the case of the Dominican Republic and also in the case of Nicaragua. In this case, we recommend to establish sound regulatory frameworks, develop institutional capabilities so that social security is for all, and living together with the private systems as long as these private systems don't put aside the universality and solidarity principle for social security to all, according to institutions and social security in the continent. Second place, given the administrative and financial difficulties that many systems have from the past and up to date in the present, it's important to ensure the financial sustainability and an efficient operation. If systems don't reach these two goals, they run the risk of suffering partial or total collapse that lead us to people not having social security. Therefore, we recommend installing technical capabilities and more than anything else, actuarial capabilities to ensure the right operation. In this environment, SISS has promoted the design of diploma courses and so that it goes hand in hand with the Social Security studies, and that is going to available for you. In the third place, the reforms said have to be based on the right diagnosis and elaborated by professional multitask groups. And this implies that the comprehensive management of the system has to be based on evidence, and they should consider all the time the social goal of the systems in decision making. A fourth place is that the report also allows us to find and face ourselves to the lack of access of statistical information that can be updated, comparable, that will allow us to see how institutions provide satisfaction to the well-being requirements of Latin American people, but also which are those factors that pressure so that these institutions will expand the coverage and therefore are able to provide whatever it takes for social security in the continent. And in this sense, we'd like to invite from the SISS, we invite you to build sound statistical systems that are predictable, that can be at the reach of the public in general for research schemes as the one developed through the Social Security report, as well as for decision making by the government. And in the fifth place, something that we believe is core is strengthening the pension systems for the protection of old age and the protection of revenues due to lack of a job. So these two elements, the insurance of health and insurance against job are of great importance. And last, I feel that it's also important to mention that this COVID-19 turning point sets a scenario where allows us to think if Social Security that we have is the one we can have, or we have to go another way. And in this sense, our invitation is always going to be open to be able to have a social dialogue and as of there build public policy proposals and also build the instrumentations of regimes that will provide an opportunity for people that have been historically excluded from Social Security and from this Social Security right. Without anything further, and not to take much of your time, I would like to thank the team again. I also want to thank the commentators that are with us today, and I would like to give floor to commentators. Please. Mr. Robledo, Zoe Robledo, if you'd like to take the floor. Yes, thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. Dr. Gibran Ramirez Reyes, Secretary General of SISS, and all the other commentators and all the team involved in this important work of research that is very, very of high quality, and Miguel Frida, Jose Antonio, and so everyone. Since the middle of the 19th century, Benito Juarez was saying that there couldn't be any true joy and happiness in the widest concept of well being without health and without freedom. In the 19th century, they stated these first drawings of the social rights when our countries were finding different ways uh, to define judicial certainty of the new citizens of the independent America. And in that sense, I feel that this report comes at the right time, and that is what is distinguishing it and can be distinguished from other efforts because it came at a crucial turning point where the pandemic has revealed and has even opened up and made the reality completely transparent. What are the implications when there's models that they do not tend to universality? And this happens with deep inequalities that we know become inequalities that could put at risk a life of people, not only the life of people, but also the freedom. So this is a great effort for many reasons. On the one hand, because it tells us that Social Security is a phenomenon that can be comparable. And secondly, because it is a political phenomenon, maybe in that sense, these are political efforts, the ones that could have repercussions in correcting errors or in strengthening a path where things could end up being positive. So we've also seen throughout the year, we've been able to perceive how many truths have crumbled. We've seen that the wealth of nations is not what's important, but the strength of the state. The state is the one that can solve a pandemic in a more efficient manner and in a more in a scenario of lots of inequalities. So therefore, we've been able to articulate the health systems. We've been able to articulate the well-being systems that have set the difference in this pandemic, and the region cannot stop looking at this experience for the years to come. And by reviewing this report, there's two conclusions that I think are clear. One of them, we have this historical thing that we have to ensure Social Security for all. That the well-being factor is not an idea, an ambiguous idea, as was stated by the governments or by the political exercises defined in another way, but they turn into a reachable ideal and in a demand, in a need, in a growing need of the population. We cannot close our eyes before a Latin American reality that has not changed in many decades in the production and in the exclusion of large sectors of society towards spheres of poverty, that around 200 million people that live in extreme poverty and 10% of our population that lives in extreme poverty, 200 in some kind of poverty and 10% in extreme poverty. Future is not easy, but that cannot stop us. We have to start thinking in a regional manner on how are we going to find the solutions, and that the projections that we look into with lots of uncertainty, we'll start finding studies like this one, guides, BIMs, lights, to put our finger on the problems to ensure that the social security deficiencies are overcome. The worst thing that could happen to us after the pandemic is not using this moment as the engine of promotion towards a transformation. And with regards to what we've seen and lived since the Social Security, I wanted to share with you some experiences on how also the flexibilization of the coverage models can also be a path, not a gradual path, but can be aggressive in order to incorporate new modalities of work towards Social Security. And one of them is the a program to expand the workers' work in their home in our country is core, because maybe there is no large expression of the inequality of our country that a work that for a long time seemed to be didn't have any type of security, with wages that were really ridicule, and with under working conditions that were very hurtful. And it is not an effort of the previous government, but this is a resolution of the Supreme Court of Justice that mandated Social Security to determine that there is discrimination of home workers that would simulate openness and inclusion. And under that, and in that sense, during this pandemic, this was expressed importantly because people's home workers are around 2 million men and women. They're homemakers that are like an internal migration from rural to urban, and at the same time they give back the resources to the rural areas in many cases that live in poverty. So this has allowed us to continue growing in other sectors, in other segments that for many years have lived not only in the informal sector, but also in this exclusion model. So in this sense, I believe that, like we saw in some of the case studies of Social Security for the family, in the case of Social Security, what's been demonstrated is that our insurance is deficient. Our Social Security is not enough. It's deficient because it is not enough. It doesn't reach all. It's a model just to comply with an idea that has in existence for 20 years without incorporating any important segments of independent workers and freelance workers. So in our country, a few months back, at the beginning of May, they determined that Social Security had to invoke its Article 214 that establishes those scenarios where Social Security, and in particular our maternity leave security, and it serves people that are not Social Security affiliates, but everyone. So in the case of COVID, we've been served 23,000 Mexican men and women that they wouldn't have had any space under the health systems offered by the Mexican state for people without Social Security, simply because this model is completely fragmented and without any a quality standard in the service among each of the 32 states making up the Mexican Republic. So this cannot be only an example of health-related matters. We have to see how can we put the society at risk when we don't walk towards universalization. So I'd like to close by saying that I believe there's three main features, three main characteristics of this report that motivate us a great deal. First of all, it has a, a feeling of hope, and it publishes uh, the possibility of a regional effort. We've participated, and I've participated in several spaces from CEPAL, the OECD, the ministerial meetings, but we're always focused towards some cases, in the case of the pandemic, in other cases, driving towards jobs. But we never put the Social Security umbrella as the topic that could integrate it all. And the second topic, I think, is very good because this pandemic came with a lot of problems, but a lot of possibilities of change and transformation. A structural problem has been like the sanitary emergency, health emergency implies that the solutions have to be structural in nature. Nothing would be more tragic than going back to do things as we were doing them before once this health emergency is over. If it leaves us some lesson is that the structural transformation must be based in the solidarity, and as said by Dr. Gibran Ramirez, this is not sharing losses amongst all and concentrating earnings amongst few, because that is obvious that has not given good results. And moreover, it is a way of teaching us, because through this compared analysis, we'll be able to work and trace many paths and results that have worked. So I simply wish to tell you that this is, I insist, a no great opportunity. Our nations lived a 19th century that was emancipating, that liberated a lot of people, but a lot of blood and efforts took place. But these citizens and this new citizenship was born, and the 20th century in many different ways is a century that, aside from Social Security, established in it a political citizenship was established, the establishment of a universal vote, the establishment of a vote that is free and direct, that today it's so easily said, but it cost a life to many people. And then the 21st century is a cycle, is a century not marked by the pandemic, but it's a century that finally is one where we dared setting forth a social citizenship and that doesn't exist with universal Social Security. So again, congratulations for this well-invested time that resulted in a report that is so interesting and is so good, and this is a great contribution in the middle of this complicated situation. Thank you so much for your kind words, Mr. Zoe Robledo Aburto, in this Social Security Conference, and General Director or CEO of the IMSS, that is the captain of the boat of the ship that is heading this COVID-19 sanitary crisis. So I'd like to give Mr. Brenner and the International Association of Social Security the floor. Mariano, we'd love to give you the floor. So, good day to everybody. Good afternoon from Geneva. To start, I would like to thank the CISS personally, its president of the IMSS, Roberto Aburto, and Gilberto Ramirez, General Secretary, and the team for the organization of this presentation of report. Personally, as the regional director for the Americas and as representative of the National Association of Social Security, it's a great pleasure to be and share with you this event. Secondly, I would like to congratulate all those that participated in the development of this report. We can clearly see the deep analysis that this implied, and I found it very educational and easy for the public in general. I like to see the bibliography that is used in the report, and here I found 28 pages of references that said the clear depth of this research. And with regards to the report structure, I think it's important to underscore the format adopted, where we see the analysis of the Social Security and saying that towards the end of the 1970s, practically all countries in the continent had a Social Security system, but clearly with differentiated benefits. So there we go to the transformation era in Social Security that started as of 1970 today to see some Social Security, and there was with some Social Security that had contributions, others didn't have contributions. We do a qualitative analysis of the last few years, and this research allows us to understand what is going on when we go to the second part of the report. And I'm not going to talk about the quantitative analysis. It's going to be done later on, but I'd like to underscore something that happens in the conclusions of the report and have to do with the importance of the availability and truthfulness of the data. So without that, it would be impossible to check any type of management and any type of historical analysis. With regard to the second part, I think it's very interesting to see the different countries chosen for the case study for each identified group regarding their performance of Social Security, indicating for each of these countries the situation of the coverage and their performance in the last few years, and show how these countries have taken advantage of favorable economic situations in their effort to expand the coverage. And I'm very pleased to see the inclusion of the CARICOM, the Caribbean community, because it's a very important region that includes countries that have a particular reality because of their geographies and origin is different from the other countries in the region, and it's worth to be analyzed and commented. And beyond the reality of this particular moment that has been darkened by the pandemic, these countries are doing important efforts to update themselves and expand coverage to the groups that have been excluded from many of the systems, such as the freelance workers. And there's other countries like Uruguay and Chile that have been the pioneers in the region for the development of Social Security system, but at the beginning of the 20th century, and others with a development that were later on, like Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic, in the middle of the 20th century. Likewise, countries of CARICOM that they did all this hard work in Social Security in the 20th century. The case studies were very interesting because of the analysis they did regarding the Social Security in these countries and the historical events that were in parallel to this development. I see a follow-up of a Social Security system that today is easy to obtain in Google or getting the webpage of institutions, but doing a holistic analysis of legislation and the development of system, as I said in this report, is something more complicated and requires considerable analysis. The study that goes hand in hand with each of these cases allows us to understand the reason why some decisions were made politically and why the Social Security designs for pensions and regarding health. So later we could have a better understanding of how have you reached the design of Social Security systems that exist today in the region. So understanding the present through the past and be able to think about the future according to lived experiences. And in this point, that those that are interested in learning more about the different topics related to social securities of these countries and others in the world, I invite you to visit the ICE and also the reflection of Social Security of 180 countries and territories. It is interesting that as of the reading of the report, we can make a comparison of how Chile adopted the pension fund administration system and individual accounts, whereas Uruguay also has a system that is more moderate and has a mixed system. We can also see the role of social players in the reforms or attempt of reforms, where we can see this when the report talks about the evolution of the health center in the Dominican Republic, for example. Another element that can be seen in the report and stands out at the beginning of the chapter in Nicaragua is the high rate of informality that exists in the region, and in particular in some countries, and that leaves outside the contributive systems many workers and making them particularly vulnerable because they lack social security in case of accidents, work accidents, and they don't have any access to resources, and they're not benefited to the portability of rights like in social security, like it's mentioned in the chapter of the pandemic. And I would also foresee here the importance of the policies of social security institutes. In many cases of good policies have gone south or have had negative results or not as positive results because of the policy, and the good administration is an essential conditions to apply the goals of this policy and the positive results in social security. If not, we lose trust, coverage levels drop, social inclusion drops, and well-being drops. The policy and the application of the policy should always go hand in hand. And this is a point that is very important in the Americas because there's some privatization arguments of years back has been connected to matters related to better governance and the need of competition. Another very interesting point that can be found in the main first chapters, in the study chapters, is the presence of international organization and the role that they have played in the development of social security systems in our countries. And this is clearly presented in the case of Chile, for example. And last, at the beginning as well as at the end of the report, they mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is a topic that I could not miss in any of these types of reports. I think the pandemic has demonstrated its importance and the need for social security and solidarity systems, and is putting in evidence what social securities in countries lack, in particular with regards to access to social security systems and insurance against unemployment. So maybe this is a starting point for new transformation in social security systems. And here again, I invite you to the International Association of Social Security webpage to see our reports and notes and see how the social security in the world is facing this pandemic. Thank you again to the SISS for inviting me to this report, giving me the report with some time ahead of time so I could review it. Mariano, thank you. And yes, you're right. Hopefully, this is a point, the starting point to put Social Security in the center.
so that we can propose the improvements which are in the public agenda, policies that have not taken their proper place. Now I would like to give the floor to Humberto Soto de la Rosa. He is the official in charge for social issues in CEPAL. He is an expert in topics of social development for Central America. Humberto, thank you very much. We are grateful for participation from our friends from CEPAL. To me, it's always a pleasure to work with you. Now I want to greet everyone in the audience. I also want to greet the General Secretary of the CISS, Mr. Gibran. Thank you for your invitation to comment on this report, which is an input that will be of great benefit and relevance in this time in history where social security, as my previous speaker said, has appeared as a fundamental aspect to guarantee a minimum level of well-being for the population. We faced an emergency like never before, where we have challenges for population like loss of jobs and revenues and income, among others. I also want to greet the special guests who were speakers, Mrs. Robledo, Mr. Mariano Bremen, and also I congratulate the work team that made this report. I have worked with them in some of their research, stating this report goes beyond the intention of showing the status and evolution of social security systems in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. I believe this is one of the strong points of this report. It becomes a motivating and challenging instrument that invites us to reflect on the future of social security. It does so first by taking us through a history through the social security systems in the world, and this made me remember, and it was mentioned before by other colleagues, that statement that says that he who does not know his history is condemned to repeat it. I would dare to change a little bit by saying that those who know their history are forced to not repeat the mistakes of the past. This tour in the first two chapters and also in the case studies, because we must mention that situation in the case studies. They also review the history of the social systems in those countries. They mention a series of problems that have existed during the history of social security systems in the world, and they are still here. The first one, I will call it a motivational dilemma. The reason why a social security system is generated, and this has been historically debated between providing a labor benefit as a privilege against a vision of guaranteeing a right. In the beginning, the idea of granting this privilege, and this is how I call it because it didn't exist for anyone except for some exceptions. At first, it was presented for a population group that was claiming much more than that, a working class demanding rights that now we know clearly economic, social, and cultural rights that go beyond social security. Although the dilemma is still in force because social security is still not guaranteed as a right, I would say that it's only guaranteed in a pragmatic way. In a strict way, there is no dilemma. Social security should be a right, and we should only establish a route to reach it. The second dilemma is the fragmented reality of the current social security systems that is also shown in the report, and it's established in the ideas to defragmenting against homologating. This means to achieve a unified social security system, preserving the fragments but also homologating their benefits or homologating the whole system as in itself. This, solving this dilemma will be central to achieving social security with equality. The case of Uruguay shows that this is possible, and CEPAL likes this solution due to the actual difficulty of completely homologating the systems, but with a consideration in the far future. Now, the topic of acquired rights is important in this context, but we should also talk about the social pact that will allow us to reach that homologation. The history mentioned in the document shows some fragments in which it indicates that this happened in the past, and there were times in which they homologated some fragments of the system, and that implied reverting some acquired rights that were above the prescribed levels. A third dilemma is achieving financial sustainability of the social security system vis-a-vis the benefits and the coverage. There are huge challenges in this regard because most of the systems face great funding challenges that are also facing the need, as has been shown by the pandemics, of achieving greater benefits and of expanding to the whole population. This dilemma takes us to go back to have techniques on the service of politics. Sustainability may be an immediate path, but history shows that it's not necessarily enough, as is the case of the path that Chile took to privatizing pensions. Due to the existence for some years of these heterogeneous systems, in the specific case of the health system, the existence of some problems that kept them from being successful long-term, linked to the two previous dilemmas about heterogeneity and level of coverage or benefits. We see proposing minimum levels as far as proposing minimum well-being conditions. This is just a base. It's important now to reflect if those minimum are related to a guarantee by law. We see that a vision of progressivity could be good so that through minimum levels we can guarantee a first step, but without losing a horizon of optimality. The benefit of minimum levels for some and more for others repeats a situation of inequality that we don't desire, was mentioned before. So in this case, we have to evolve. The next dilemma is more pragmatic. It has to do with the possibility to revert structural reforms in matters of pensions in a drastic way, or live with dual schemes in which individual capitalization can live together with schemes based on solidarity. Solving this dilemma is another challenge that requires strong participation of technique and decision making based, as was said before, in the largest amount of information and scenarios possible. In my opinion, absolute reversion should not be the means. Let's remember the previous situation was unsustainable financially. The source of all these reforms also happened because of a scenario where they did not see a favorable horizon. Therefore, it would not be good to go back to that scenario. But I believe that the adequate word would be to evolve to better systems. Another dilemma that we see in this report in its contents is finding the search of formalizing jobs for all the population, or finding a way of alternate schemes that gives access to social security to the population that doesn't have formal jobs. This goes beyond the social security system, but not social policy of which they are part and of which for which the solution involves them. My question, is it possible to achieve this vision of universal formalization, or is it better to find alternatives? I don't have the answers. This question is open and we have to find ways to solve it. Finally, regarding the dilemmas, I bring in one more that should always be on the table of analysis of social security systems. It appears in this, I didn't see in the study, although I believe that it will be taken again in future studies. This is to take parametric reforms opposed to promoting structural reforms. In this, I call people involved in this type of decisions to pay attention to the reflection about the future of labor and the changes that the fourth technological revolution will bring. The work in the future will not be the same, and so the schemes will have to evolve, and maybe this is time to make this question. Now, it is important to stress chapter 3 that refers to the quantitative analysis, where I had more participation. This analysis reflects pressure, coverage, and efficacy of social security systems in a traditional way, but through the incorporation of an index called specific pressure also gives us a tool that can be of great use for reflecting on the future of social security systems. In this regard, I want to say that this effort to build indexes that we can compare among different countries has not been exempt of information restrictions that can limit the scope of this analysis. We only mentioned some components of Social Security, specifically health and pensions. We know that there are more than those components in the systems, but It's not been possible to analyze all of them due to the lack of information, and also they reinforce the importance of continue to develop statistical systems in the framework of social security. What's most relevant, in my opinion, of this chapter is that it shows that if we start from the traditional vision of social security, where the idea is to protect an urban population that is incorporated that can incorporate formal labor, the system can provide certain needs for expansion, and through the pressure index that appears in the report that considers those aspects, we can propose a need for expansion, and this indicates that there should be an organization. This organization should be reverted if instead of these indicators we use others that reflect the potential pressure in the systems with the incorporation of all the sectors of the population, regardless of whether they are rural, urban, or formal or informal. And this is one of the great contributions of the report, because this index shows that there is a different horizon, a different pressure to the systems in the future, depending on the decisions made in that regard. I also want to repeat that the indices of coverage and efficacy use general variables, also due to information availability, but the way information is measured for all the population and not only for the population that's affected. The study gives us the opportunity to analyze those indexes at the light of the contribution of Social Security towards universal well-being. This it's a very pertinent input that shows the importance that this will have in the future prospective analysis of financial sustainability, of expansion of coverage of the systems, all the decisions made towards universalization and incorporation of informal or rural sectors, and expansion of coverage both in the actuarial analysis made as well as in the strategies defined for the long term in a horizon of social security that has evolved, and this is a great contribution of the report. The case studies are of great utility to know the experiences in other countries, very diverse. This leads to observing, in the case of others, potential results of decisions that we could propose. Uruguay with its success, but with many challenges. Chile with models that have not achieved their objectives at the best level, and this has been reflected recently in social unrest. The Dominican Republic with its recent history of progress in the law that have approached these problems with success. Nicaragua with its great drive to more coverage and benefits that faces sustainability and viability financially, and that again indicates the importance of placing technique at the service of public politics. In this case, the actuarial studies. Finally, the Caribbean countries that have a different history based on their origin and social security system, but show that the challenges are similar in spite of different origins. To summarize, history shows us the evolution, the origin of several of the challenges that we're facing, a great heterogeneity that will be difficult to homogenize, even though history shows cases in which it has been achieved and that we should analyze. Privatization that has not been such a great remedy. Therefore, we have to think twice before we take the next step, make studies that go beyond the technical aspect, a very well thought of perspective about future changes. This pressure toward system from the traditional perspective that shows a trend that goes against a pressure from the universal perspective. And finally, this progress in coverage and efficacy that is reflected in these indicators, and not because of that it prevents the challenges. I want to finish by mentioning that from CEPAL we subscribe largely the recommendations and learnings from the report, as the case of the proposals for articulation and different schemes for social protection beyond their fragmentation, which is a complex situation. We also favor universality that is sensitive to differences So with that, what they take into account in the design of the systems, taking down the cycle of life, of childhood, youth, adulthood, and senior citizens. They are not the same as far as their needs for social security and also for specific groups such as women, but also historically excluded groups of people. We're talking about people who live in rural areas, but also immigrants who have been traditionally excluded from social security, emphasizing the challenge with informality with which supplementary between contributive and non-contributive schemes is mentioned as an option, considering that universal non-contributive pensions accompanying public systems of care together with contributive systems. I repeat my congratulations for this document that through a very interesting combination between retrospective historic analysis and classroom combining qualitative and quantitative technologies and case studies, I am sure that this will motivate and challenge people involved in these topics vis-a-vis the reflection about the future of social security systems in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Al parecer está cerrado el micro de quien está hablando.
Um, we, we apologize from the interpreter's booth. The mic of the person who's currently speaking is off, so we cannot hear him. Humberto, thank you very much. Cepal, thank you very much. And now, due to time restrictions, I'm going to give the floor to José Antonio Hernández to read the conclusions before we close this session by reviewing the network through which we transbroadcast this transmission. We only found one question that has to do with information sources used for the graphic data from the Dominican Republic. We are showing it right now. The chart is about persons affiliated to the health family insurance, and the information was obtained from information from the Seguro, and it comes from the link that we show on screen. There are no other questions. I would like to ask if there are any questions on the chat. Otherwise, there's one coming. Good morning. Now, based on the pandemics necessary to give sustainability to health and pension services, what are the recommendations for countries in the Americas? Greetings from Costa Rica. Well, the problem of sustainability is quite complex, and as Humberto Soto mentioned, it generated some changes, some reforms during the 80s and 90s that some benefits were reduced, pensions were privatized, health systems were privatized, and we consider that sustainability is one of the most important values of our systems, and that is facing challenges due to the increase of population, but we also consider that it's important to put it together with the aspiration to have universal coverage. Specifically, there are complexities due to the way in which the systems are financed, the fact that they depend on contributions from the employers and on the workers is a challenge in the future, mainly because of what Humberto mentioned, the future of labor, although it's not the immediate future, but it is likely that automation and remote work will displace and reduce the amount of jobs and payment, and wages. So the best thing would be to go to mixed schemes for funding, in which we will have contributions from workers and employers. We also have other types of contributions from the state through taxes. Sometimes it's difficult to talk about taxes, but in this case, these are resources that will help the well-being of people. So that's the most feasible thing, to go to mixed sources for funding. That would be my answer. I would just like to add something that we believe is very important. The discussion about ways of funding always comes together with actuarial technical studies that allow us to review sustainability of the systems. This is important because in the case of some of the countries that were studied, these studies would not, and this implied deficiencies both in their sustenance and the type of benefits, extension, and level of those benefits. In that regard, through the conference we found, and with the discussion with our institutions, which is one of the most important requirements, which is actuarial technical training. And from here, CISS, we want to contribute so that all the institutions are strengthened through training. Thank you, Jose Antonio. After all these very valuable contributions from our speakers and the research team, I want just to stress one of the main learnings from this report: the need to establish solid regulatory frameworks and develop the state's capacities to take back the control and responsibility to guarantee the human right to social security and the well-being. After 40 years of tests of the neoliberal failure, it continues to determine the lives of peoples. And environment will this is urgent that we have taken back in this conference is that of pensions. We state that it's necessary to take back and recognize the public character of pension systems. We don't discard the possibility to have the participation of private sector, as Humberto said, but as long as this doesn't mean affecting the human right to social security. So we recommend to guarantee it by having mixed models that comply international standards. For example, granting at least 40% of replacement rate, and they should also be financially sustainable. The need of state strengthening is not only for this environment. We need to make it more rigorous in all fields of social security. This can be done in an aggressive way, as Zoe Robledo mentioned, in such a way that the systems are aimed to universality. Right now, when we need wide protection for people and their well-being, for their health and for their income. These crossroads, I believe, that it represents for all of us a breaking point to represent or change this type of security that we want. This could be the end of the long century of social security and the beginning of its new dawn. All of this depends on decisions that are made now. I want to close by thanking the participation of all our speakers, the presence of our members, and the audience in general. We also repeat the commitment of this CISS and the team that guided for the well-being of the peoples of the Americas. Thank you very much.